Emily Wilson is a translator, author, translator, and professor of classical studies at the University of Pennsylvania. In 2018, Wilson translated Homer's Odyssey, becoming the first woman in English verse to do so. And in 2020, she was awarded the Guggenheim Fellowship to support her work in translating Homer's Iliad, an endeavor of 6 years. Quoting Emily Greenwood's review of the translation, as Simone Weil observed in her perceptive 1941 essay, The Iliad, or the Poem of Force, eventually everyone pays, spiritually if not materially. The glory and the futility are intertwined. Wilson reproduces this tragic structure impeccably, sometimes precisely by knowing when to work beyond and between Homer's lines. As Wilson herself explains in a 2023 New Yorker interview, quote, "My goal was to evoke an experience like the original, using the language of the people who will read it. She has seen the signal fires from afar and passed them on to a new age, our age, that awaits future readers and future culture to relearn the very human lessons of these epics." Won't you join me in welcoming Emily Wilson?
Thank you so much, Tyrone, for that wonderful introduction. I'm very honored to be Clytemnestra. It seems a very sinister note to begin on, but I promise not to kill anyone tonight. And thank you also to Victoria and Curtis and to everyone, all of you, for being here. It's an honor to be here. So I'm going to talk about my approach to retranslating primarily the Homeric poems. I'm also going to talk a little bit about translation in general, retranslation, what it is. And of course, talking about translation in the abstract is very difficult and often makes no sense. So I also want to do a little bit of reading. So I'm going to start with a reading and I'll end with another reading. And I'll intersperse a couple of case studies. So I'm going to start with a reading which comes from the middle of the Odyssey, but is a kind of new beginning to the poem. This is the scene in which Odysseus, who of course has been trying to get home, or not necessarily always trying to get home, sometimes shacked up with two wonderful immortal goddesses, and with whom he spends 8 years. But in this passage that I'm going to read, he finally does get back geographically to Ithaca, thanks to the kind Phaeacians who lend him a magical self-steering ship. If you haven't read the Odyssey recently, it may be a surprise to realize that the geographical nostos, the geographical journey home, happens halfway through, which of course is a signal that nostos, homecoming, is not just about the place you're in. It's about the recognitions of who this character is and his relationships with everyone that he's going to reunite with and or kill once he finally gets back. So this is the magical self-steering ship. Euthoion ananclinthentes anariptun halapedo, kaito nedumos hypnos, epiple pharoisia pipta, negretos, hedistos, thanato ankista eoikos. Climbing on, he lay there quietly. The rowers sat down on the benches calmly and then loosed the cable from the mooring stone. They pulled, leaning back hard. The oar blades splashed the water. A sound, sweet sleep fell on his eyes like death. He did not stir. As 4 fine stallions rushed at the whip and raced their chariot across the track, heads high, an easy canter, so was the ship's prow raised. The seething waves of sounding purple sea rushed round the stern as she sped straight ahead. The swiftest bird a hawk could never overtake. She sailed so fast and cleaved the waves. She bore a man whose mind was like the gods, who had endured many heartbreaking losses and the pain of war and shipwreck. Now he slept in peace, and he remembered nothing of his pain. So I hope you can hear from that passage something of what my Homeric translations in general are going for. I use regular iambic pentameter to echo the regular dactylic meter of the original. I want to honor the clarity of Homer, the quick narrative pace, the read-aloud ability, and to convey the precise, vivid details in describing movement through the material, physical world, so that it feels very real even when what's happening is totally fantastical. There was never actually a self-steering ship like this, even in archaic Greece. I also think this passage can provide an interesting metaphor for thinking about the task of the translator, maybe a related metaphor to the signal fires, moving from Homeric Greek to contemporary English. I have to carry my readers across unfathomable distances of space and time. I hope that sometimes I do so with so much ostensibly easy energy that the reader, like the sleeping Odysseus, barely notices where they are and what I'm doing, and how hard I've worked to get them there. But I also want the reader to be sometimes aware of the speed, that there's a sort of time travel whiplash, as the narrator is in this passage, through those fantastic images of the stallions and the hawk, both of which remind us, this is how fast this is going, this is extraordinary. Odysseus himself eventually wakes up bewildered on his own island, which he can't recognize because Athena, whom he also can't recognize, has covered it with magic mist. I want the reader of my ancient translations to sometimes have that experience too, of not quite knowing where we are. Are we in modernity or are we in antiquity? Can we tell the difference? Might we be disoriented about where we are in our own times? Okay, so I'm going to talk just a little bit about what translation in general is. So translation in general is very difficult because it always involves a deep, immersive sense of the idioms of both the source language and the target language. If you don't have both those things, you're going to mess up as a translator. And that's the case whether or not it's an ancient literary epic poem, even if it's a shampoo bottle, even if it's an ad or a menu. If you don't have an immersive sense of how the language that you're writing in or translating into works, and what the expectations of the reader in that language are, as well as the idioms of the one you're translating from, you're going to mess up. You're not going to achieve what you think you're achieving. I also want to emphasize that translation is a very intense form of reading, and it's also an even more intense form of writing. I find that, especially in talking about translation from ancient languages, which are perceived as difficult, people very often imagine the difficult bit is reading the original. But of course, that's actually, I was reading the original for decades, and without thinking about how to translate it, that's not the job that I was doing for the past 12 years working on these translations. The job I was doing for the past 12 years was not reading Homer, but figuring out how to put Homer into English. And that's a writing task, which for me involves endless processes of rewriting a draft that's almost okay, but then turns out to have some fatal flaw as soon as I read it out loud. I also find that it's really useful for me to have multiple different readers of my drafts at different stages so that I can get feedback from different kinds of readers, including those who've read the originals and those who haven't, so that I can understand how is this landing with different kinds of readers. When we talk about translation or think about translation, if we're not translators or haven't thought about this a lot, there can be very misleading binaries that are very common in our culture. And of course, we also live in a culture that tends to be fairly monolingual. One of the binaries that I think is most common and maybe most misleading is the idea that a translation is either poetic, which means it's pretty but it's false, or it's literal, which means it's the absolute truth. And the absolute truth is assumed to be a translation that prioritizes echoing the word order of the original, even if it wasn't weird in the original, and it's weird in the translation to do that. That isn't obviously the only way to think about truth in text. It isn't obviously a lie to make a text that's a poem sound poetic. If it sounded poetic in the original, I think it's more truthful if it sounds in some ways like the poeticness of the original. We can talk more about other binaries too. I think the idea that using sort of an idea that it's going to sound like weird English and you're sort of making up a fake tradition because the original is old. Archaic isn't the same as ancient, and archaizing style of English isn't the same as Homeric Greek. I also think that we have particular problems in thinking about translation within classical studies, partly because the way that Latin and ancient Greek and actually other non-spoken languages are often taught contributes to an idea that what you're doing in the introductory Latin classroom is solving a crossword puzzle, and that you're substituting. The original is fundamentally incomprehensible and always will be. But what you do, for this unknown reason, because your teacher tells you to, is you look up the words in the dictionary, you solve the problem of how does this incomprehensible syntax fit together, put it all together, and you've solved the puzzle, you get the A, teacher praises you. But you haven't actually learned to read fluently in Latin. And that's not presented as the goal. If you have that idea of translation is solving a crossword puzzle, then that may also contribute to a limitation in how people think about what would it be to create a translation that would be an equivalent experience to an ancient text, if you're imagining that it is actually possible to have a fluent experience of that text in the original. If you're a language teacher grading a bunch of exams, you're looking out for differences between them in the sense of this one made this mistake, this one didn't, and you're grading on that level. In the case of published translations of literary texts where the translators are reasonably competent, there can still be wildly different approaches. And so in that kind of case, difference isn't primarily about did somebody make a mistake. It's about the different ways that you can approach interpreting what is this text like and how can I create an equivalent experience for it. These are all self-portraits of Picasso by Picasso, and they're not different because Picasso was lying in some of them and making a mistake in some of them, but then finally he started telling the truth once he was in his Cubist period or something. That's not how it works. It's the same as there can be multiple productions of a particular play which can all interpret the play in different ways. There can be multiple ways of performing the same piece of music. So my approach to retranslation, the media headlines I thought were kind of misleading in the ways that media headlines tend to be misleading. We can talk about either one of them if you want. I do think that both of them are radically misleading. With the Iliad, they couldn't do with the Odyssey, almost every headline had, wow, someone was a woman and a classicist at the same time. It's extraordinary. And then with the Iliad, they couldn't do that because Caroline Alexander, kudos to her, had already published a translation of the Iliad into English. So that then there had to be another simplistic headline, which was modernity. To me, the fact that one of my primary goals as a translator of the Homeric poems was to use a very traditional, regular meter, iambic pentameter, and I used phrases like cataclysmic wrath, neither of which seemed to me to add up to this is markedly more modern than the many generations of free verse translations, many of which have far more colloquialisms and what I would call modern phrasing than mine do. But journalists have got to make a living, so that's okay. I wanted to just outline some of the things that I think are relevant in my background for my work as a translator. Translators are always straddling two worlds, making a bridge between two different worlds. And of course, as a translator, I'm always trying to make a bridge between antiquity and modernity. I also, as you can hear from how I talk, I grew up in Oxford, England. I spent the first half of my life there. That's, to me, relevant in several ways, including the fact that I didn't go to an American high school and get told to read a particular translation of Homer as a teenager. So I didn't imprint on a particular translation of Homer at that formative age. Instead, I imprinted on the Greek, because I was lucky enough to go to a high school where I started learning Greek as a teenager. So I was excited about the Greek poems as opposed to a particular way of translating them. And so I think sometimes in this country, I've felt that people think I'm more iconoclastic than I am, because I'm not destroying some icon that everyone loved in 9th grade, because I didn't go to 9th grade. I also think that one of the other things that I think is relevant for my background is the fact that I have degrees in classics, but also in English literature, and my training in Shakespeare, Milton, the long tradition of Anglophone metrical poetry. I didn't do that because I was training to write metrical translations. I thought I was just doing it because I was interested and I love it. But in fact, that was very good training for writing these epic poems that are in an epic meter, and I'm trying to lean in hard to the proto-dramatic qualities of the Homeric poems as well as the tragedies that I've translated, it was useful training to have spent so much time reading Anglophone English poetry as well as ancient poetry. And I could say other things about different worlds. I mean, one other thing I'll just say is that I've always been interested in writing for my colleagues, but also writing for other kinds of publics. I've also taught at Penn for the last 20 years, and that's also informed me in ways that my Oxford education didn't inform me about how seriously people can study ancient texts in translation. And so my experiences in the classroom with students who are grappling with ancient texts read in translation made me take translation seriously as the way that so many people have access and engage with these texts. And then also my scholarly interests beyond translation have always been centered on versions of the fire from Troy that goes from one place to another, on versions of classical reception and what happened to ancient literature in later periods. Translation is exciting to me partly because it means that I can become part of that story and light some fires somewhere else. I also wanted just to point out that I put the cute little picture of the chameleon on there because I want, if possible, to be doing different things in the different translations that I've published, because the originals are so different. So I want my Odyssey translation not to sound the same as my Iliad translation. I took a long time I went from the Odyssey straight on to the Iliad, but it took me a long time to sort of adjust and get in tune with what I wanted to do with the Iliad, because I knew it couldn't be the same as what I was doing with the Odyssey, because the feel of the original poem is very different. The whole atmosphere is very different. Similarly, I've published translations of Euripides, whom I love. I've also published a translation of Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannos. The denseness of metaphors that's there in Sophocles is totally different from the way similes work in Homer, totally different again from how Euripides uses metaphor. My first published translations were of Seneca, and of course with those I wanted to lean into the possibilities of bombast and show-off allusions, and I didn't want to do that with Homer because I felt it was alien to the oral poetics of the Homeric poems. So I think most of these I've already mentioned in certain ways. I think a translator can never do everything. A translation is always totally different from the original, and yet it's also trying to be the same. What does that even mean? I think that means that one has to make some decisions about, within the impossibilities of the task, which things do I prioritize? What kinds of sameness do I prioritize? I prioritize things like sound and meter. If the original has a lot of alliteration and assonance, I want to try to do things that are like that, even if the particular sounds that I'm alliterating are going to be different because it's a different language. I prioritize the multiplicity of moods and voices. All the texts I've translated have been multivocal, so there are many speakers in the plays, there are many speakers in the Homeric poems. One of the things I felt in the classroom using several different translations of Homer was that my students were very often sort of not getting quite how clearly individuated Homeric characters were. And that was part of why they were finding Homer more boring than Homer is. Homer is not boring. And it's partly because there are so many different voices, so many different characters. That's also one of the big themes of Homeric scholarship over the past 20 years, is an awareness of the flexibility of Homeric narrative point of view. And then maybe final one, the pacing is also, I think, really important. With the Odyssey, I confined myself to the same number of lines as the original because I felt one of the things I want to translate is the temporality of this experience. How does it feel? It shouldn't feel slow. And part of the reason my students were bored, I felt, was that the translations were kind of bloated and were adding in too much because, of course, as a translator, you're constantly thinking, I could do 20 different things with this one word, and so I'm going to put down 5 things, and I've covered all my bases, but then you've lost something, which was the time. With the Iliad, I let myself have more lines because I felt it was impossible to do the line-for-line thing, and I actually think it was better, but I'm thinking of going back and redoing the Odyssey. I might do it I might be doing this forever, actually. That would be okay. Sorry, I'm going to go back and talk a tiny bit about how I think we tend to not to think translation has an obligation to be original. If it's a retranslation, I think it does. There's no point in spending years and years laboring over something if it's exactly the same as several other translations that are out there. So when I was first asked by Norton to consider doing these translations, I did some sort of meditation on my experiences in the classroom with various translations, and realized that I felt there were sort of two main ways that translating Homer had been done over the 20th, 21st century. There were some more archaizing, more literalizing, longer lines, free verse translations. There were some prose ones. There were some free verse that are much chattier and more colloquial, like the Fagles ones, the Lombardo ones, the Mitchell ones, and so on. And I felt that there was really room for something that was very strict about traditional meter, and that was also leaning into the possibilities of both clarity and speed and paciness and emotion, but also weirdness, that it can be clear and emotionally affecting while also being in certain ways alien. So these are some of the central features of Homeric poetics that seemed to me essential in the original that I wanted to try to convey in whatever ways I could with my translations. And I won't read the whole thing, but what I want to emphasize is that I felt that some translations that I'd used located complexity in the wrong places, that I wanted to locate complexity not in syntax. Homeric syntax in Greek is not difficult. The syntax of the translation, therefore, should not be difficult. But the psychology of how do people relate to each other, and what kind of world is this, and how are we building up this picture of a society, that's really difficult. And you're going to obscure that more interesting difficulty if you just front load the syntax is difficult. Okay, so I'm going to move towards a little translation case study. Maybe before I do this, just as a setup, since published, I don't look at translations while I'm working on my own, but once they're out, I look at a few passages of mine next to others, and that's made me even more aware of how much difference there can be, even when I didn't know I was going to be doing something different. Sometimes I am, and that's interesting. In the case of the Iliad, I wanted to have readers and listeners have a deep sense of empathy for all the warriors in this deadly conflict, to understand their fragility as well as their power, to feel and understand the different perspectives of those who are bereaved or killed, as well as the killers. In the case of the Odyssey, I wanted to ensure that the reader of the translation would understand what I think is really clear in the original, that this is a journey of nostos where we get a sense both of what is it like for the one person who gets home successfully and what is it like for everyone else whose lives are either taken or transformed by this journey of nostos. I felt that in looking at other translations, sometimes there was a flattening of perspective, such that we seem to be looking only through one perspective. So, for instance, only through Odysseus' perspective, only through Hector's perspective. Many translations, for instance, make Calypso, the goddess with whom Odysseus spends 7 years, seem like a hysterical nymphomaniac, a quote-unquote nymph in the English sense, which is not the sense of the Greek. Many modern translators make the Cyclops into a quote-unquote monster, even though the original makes it really clear that he's an anthropos, he's a human being, even though he's also a human being who, when his space is invaded, eats the people who are invading him. Okay, so I'm going to move to my little case study. So this is, the case study I'm going to do is from the Odyssey, the moment after Odysseus has killed all the suitors who've been harassing his wife Penelope. And then after that, he delegates the final set of killings of the 13 enslaved people who've served the bodies of the suitors. He tells his dopey son Telemachus to do that final set of killings. One of the big questions in the Odyssey is whether Telemachus is ever going to get to grow up to be a man. And of course, that's a narrative problem because the journey of Odysseus is in some ways in conflict with the journey of Telemachus to grow up. Telemachus takes initiative, one could say for the first time in the poem, by choosing a different murder weapon. He decides, rather than doing as his father had told him, to hack the life of these women out with long swords, instead he uses a thick piece of sailor's rope to hang the 12 women. And then he slices up into different body parts the single enslaved man that he kills. So this is, I think, a scene in which we have, probably I should have given content warnings before getting to this moment, but so obviously content warnings are necessary. Obviously this is a scene of gendered violence. It seems to me that it's a passage in which we get to see multiple different perspectives. We get to see both how is it that a fragile, bullied young man who's anxious about his own masculinity and honor and whether he is a boy or a man is going to have some feelings about this and have a particular way of trying to take control of women's bodies and women's voices, specifically by putting the rope around the necks. We see him in book 1 shutting up his mother. There's a continuity between the enclosure of the neck and the silencing of the women's voices. But we also get, I would argue, to see the perspective of those who were killed. So this is the Greek. I'm not going to read it because I want to make sure we have time for questions. I'm just going to point to a few details in various translation choices. So the Greek has telemachus pepneumenos. So his standard epithet suggests that he has thought about something. It's just he's got some kind of cognitive thing going on. The three, mother, father, and son, all have different kinds of cognitive-related epithets. They're all defined as being in some way thoughtful or smart. It doesn't necessarily mean he has had a really great idea right now, and I, narrator, am endorsing that. But if you make a translation choice that suggests that, like knew his own mind or thoughtful, the narrator can seem to be endorsing something which might not necessarily be as clearly endorsed by the narrator in the original. There are also questions about why Telemachus does this set of killings. Is it a just punishment for people who have agency and have chosen to act badly? Or is it a killing of humans who aren't actually human? These various translation choices that add in extra language defining the women, such as creatures or sluts, are making a very particular set of choices about both the narrative voice and Telemachus' perspective. The original doesn't have any abusive language from Telemachus in this moment. There's an amazing, as there very often is in Homer, inset simile in which the women are compared to doves or thrushes making their way home to their nests. That simile can be translated in a way that it seems like what the function of it is to dehumanize the victims. So they're just birds. So we don't need to worry about it too much. It's like killing chicken. And I think several of these translators do versions of that, where they're leaning into the simile as dehumanizing, as opposed to doing what I think is a stronger interpretation of what the original is doing, which is that the simile shows us the birds are like Odysseus. They want to go back to their homes. They want a nostos. The language of the Greek makes the bird's habitation sound like a human habitation. It's a word that can be used for where humans live as well as for where animals or doves live. And then the final detail is maybe the most horrible in the passage of the women's feet as they're hanging from the rope, moving for a little while. Some of these translations make it seem as if that's deliberate movement and there's a continuity between being a party girl and this death. So they kicked up heels for a while, or feet fluttered for a while, which I think also leans into the idea that they're still birds, so we don't need to worry so much. To me, it doesn't seem like there's a continuity in the Greek between they have done the wrong kind of thing in a slut kind of way, and that's why they're dead. I think that the Greek presents this killing as part of the process by which Telemachus and Odysseus establish total control over the space that they're claiming, and they do that by containing the possibility of women who've had sex or been raped by other men being alive to remember it, and that it's about controlling the memory as well as controlling the space. So I'll just read my translation of that passage. Telemachus then took initiative, insisting, "I refuse to grant these girls a clean death, since they poured down shame on me and mother when they lay beside the suitors." At that he wound a piece of sailor's rope round the rotunda and round the mighty pillar, stretched up so high no foot could touch the ground. As doves or thrushes spread their wings to fly home to their nests, but someone set a trap. They crashed into a net, a bitter bedtime. Just so the girls, their heads all in a row, were strung up with the noose around their necks to make their death an agony. They gasped, feet twitching for a while, but not for long. Okay, so I'm going to move from that to another also very affecting case study or passage that I think is very emotional, but in a very different kind of way. So this is the moment when, I realized that since this is a fusion talk and I'm talking about the Odyssey and the Iliad, I haven't had time to do much setup about the Iliad, but the Iliad begins by defining its subject matter as the man-in of Achilles, who is enraged for the first two-thirds of the poem against his fellow Greek, Agamemnon. But then, as a result of his prayer to Thetis, his mother, who then supplicates to Zeus to allow the Greeks to be massacred while Achilles is doing nothing, it's this paradoxical wish to regain his perceived lost honor by enabling the deaths of people on his own side. Usually you generate honor by killing the other side, and usually you generate honor by going out into battle in person and killing people in person with your spear. But Achilles generates honor in this totally paradoxical way by not moving his swift feet and letting other people die in his absence while he's just sitting on the beach being Ken. But then, of course, the fact that Achilles thinks it's okay that if the Greeks get massacred in my absence because I don't care about the Greeks, that omits the fact that he does care about one of the Greeks, which is Patroclus. So this is Achilles in his burrito pose after he's realized that his dearest person, Patroclus, has been killed by Hector. And this is his moment of expressing to his mother total ingratitude for everything she's done for him, because in fact it did him no good at all. Tende barus tenakon prosepheporos ocus Achilles. Metereme, tamma men armoi olympios exetelesen. Ala timoi ton hedos, epephilos uleth etairos, Patroclos, tonego peripanton tion hetairon, isone me kephaler, tona polasa. So this clearly has to be a moment of emotional climax. It has several very classic kind of translatory dilemmas, one of which is to do with if there's a double meaning in the original, what do you do if that's not available in the language into which you're translating? Tona polasa, that verb connotes both I lost him and I destroyed him. That ambiguity really matters because on it depends whether we think Achilles is just feeling intense grief, or is he also feeling terrible regret and guilt because it's because he sent Patroclus out wearing his armor and refused to fight himself. That's why Patroclus is dead. And then another, I think again, classic, comes up all the time for every translator issue is what do you do about metaphors that might be idiomatic in the source language and are not idiomatic in the target language? Achilles says, I loved him, isone me kephaler. In English, if you love someone very much, you don't say, I love you like my head. That's weird. And you can't say, I lost my head, because that's a different idiom. And yet, if Achilles is just saying, I lost my second self, and you lose the metaphor entirely, that's a cost, because this is a poem in which there has been quite a lot of literal decapitation. Agamemnon in particular is great at cutting people's heads off. And so I think it matters that Achilles is going to be re-entering the battlefield as if he doesn't have his head anymore, as if he's lost not just some small body part, but the most central body part. So what do we do about any of those things? I'm just going to do a quick run through of some translations of this tiny little passage. So you can, and what I want to point out is that most of the ones I've looked at don't do anything with the head thing. They just do loss of whole self. The George Chapman translation into rhyming fourteeners, I think, is awesome. It's the first published translation into English. Chapman was a great poet and great dramatist. You can also see the ways that his Christianity and his Stoicism are leaking into his translation with things like the grace of the Olympian. Zeus doesn't actually have any grace. That's not his thing at all. This is the also wonderful translation by Alexander Pope, which as Pope typically does, introduces all kinds of wonderful phrases that don't correspond to the original, like revenge itself is lost, which I think is great, and there's nothing in the Greek that suggests that, but it's wonderful. And again, there's no head. And again, another thing that one could track across these translations is the degree to which the relationship is presented as a close working relationship, that he's one of the martial train, or is it actual love? There's a verb in the original, tion, which could connote either I valued him, or I respected him, or I loved him. And so, of course, you have to make some choices about that. Are you going to say, I held him in very high esteem as a work colleague, or is it more than that? In what ways might it be more than that? And so I want to just flag in this one and the next one the ways that the archaic style, or what's sometimes perceived as the literal style, can involve various kinds of distortions, including here, I think a really interesting detail is that in the original, it's podos okus Achilles. It's swift-footed Achilles. The epithet comes first, then it's Achilles. That's the natural word order in English. The Loeb translation, which is not doing this for meter because it doesn't have meter, it's prose, flips it around and has Achilles swift of foot. That makes for oldie-timey sounding English, even though the Greek word order is not that word order, which I think is an interesting choice to make. The Lattimore translation does similar things with the word order, and you can see how he also goes for these very abstract kinds of formulation, where it's hard to have a sense of this person is absolutely devastated from phrasing like brought to accomplishment. The Fagles translation is a very different approach, which is, I just want to flag two things about this, because I think they're very characteristic of both Fagles' approach in general, but then others in more or less the Fagles mode. One is to amp up emotion in particular ways, in ways that I think are kind of sentimentalizing. So, for instance, Fagles adds in dear, as if anxious that Achilles is kind of being mean to Thetis here. He's being too rude to his mom. So Fagles makes him kinder to her by having him say, dear mother. And then he also adds in the metaphor of the burning desires, which of course is an English cliche or idiom. There aren't burning desires in the Greek. And Fagles doesn't have the metaphor which is in the Greek, which is the head thing. And the Caroline Alexander translation, I think, does many of the same things, similar moves to what we've already seen from the Lattimore translation. So I'm just going to read my translation of that, and then I'm just going to explain that I think I failed with this. Swift-footed Lord Achilles, groaning, answered, yes, mother, Zeus has granted me that prayer. But now what good to me is any of it? My friend Patroclus, whom I loved, is dead. I loved him more than any other comrade. I loved him like my head, my life, myself. I lost him, killed him. So I see this as I was trying my best, but one can't never do everything. And in this case, I emphasized a few minutes ago that I think pacing really matters, and I've lost something if I have messed up the pacing. I felt in the case of both I lost him, I killed him, and the head thing, I couldn't keep the pacing. I had to translate both those things with several different approaches in order to make sure that it lands emotionally and you don't have to check the endnotes to get what it means. Because, of course, if I do care about it needs to sound like he is devastated, I can't have him be explaining, I am using a metaphor here. Because it's probably not what he would be focused on. Okay, so I will just move on to just a couple of thoughts about why we need retranslations of ancient texts. In general, I think we need retranslations because the language into which translators are translating change. Scholarship on these texts change. Cultures change. We're asking new questions about Homer and with Homer in the 21st century from what we were asking even back in the 1990s. And also, as I hope you've seen from just the case studies that I just whizzed through, no single translation can echo every feature of the original. I think there are new ways that we can read the Odyssey nowadays that it might be different from how we might have read it even 10 years ago. The particular ways that this is a poem about a sort of early proto-form of globalization. It's a poem that was composed when the Greek-speaking world was grappling with Greek colonization and Greek awareness of the world is bigger than we thought it was 100 years ago. That also leads to a poem that's about strangers, migrants, communities, insiders and outsiders, themes which have only become more pressing in contemporary global culture. In the Iliad, when I used to read this poem for years and years before the coronavirus pandemic, I didn't realize quite as firmly as I do now, this is a poem that begins with a medical crisis, which then leads to a political crisis. That fact about the Iliad was always true of the Iliad, but it didn't land in quite the same way before we'd lived through the pandemic ourselves. So I'm going to end by reading just from the end of the Iliad, and this is a small piece of the meeting of Priam and Achilles from Book 24 of the Iliad. We often think of the Odyssey as a poem about homecoming, about strangers, recognition, hospitality. The Iliad as a poem about war, rage, and grief. But they have to be read together, and the opposite is also true. Odysseus brings the war back with him, and the Odyssey is the one that ends with a massive scene of slaughter, not the Iliad. The Iliad ends with scenes of hospitality and homecoming. Hector, the great Trojan hero, who's constantly been leaving home in the course of the poem, finally has his nostos, his homecoming, although after death. He comes home to be cared for by his family, and Achilles, who's been enraged for almost all of the poem, becomes able to act as a host, to welcome a stranger to his house, and to also recognize a version of his own grief for himself, he's soon going to die, as he now understands, and for his father, and for Patroclus, in the figure of his guest. I think the theme of the recognition of strangers also, again, resonates with the work of translation, a task in which one's always grappling with finding points of connection across vast gulfs of difference. The encounter between antiquity and modernity can feel transformative in both directions. In this scene, Achilles recognizes Priam's grief and humanity, and through doing that, he also recognizes his own limitations, his own mortality. And so there can be a way that we can learn from antiquity, and antiquity perhaps can learn from us. There can be a dialogue in a moment of encounter between different cultures. So this is when Priam comes to beg for his son's back. I'm trying to avoid son's body because that's not the language of the original. The language presents what Priam is looking for is to get Hector back. Hector's dead, so his Hector is extra vulnerable because he's dead. Priam comes to beg for Hector back from the man who killed him. Tous de la thesel thon priamos megas. Anki darastas, kersin aquila os labagunata, kai kusakeras, denas, androphonus, hai hoi poleask tananhuias. He had just finished with his food and wine. The table was still at his side. Great Priam came in unnoticed. He stood near Achilles and touched his knees and kissed his hands, the terrible, murderous hands which killed so many sons. As when delusion seizes hold of someone who kills a man in his own fatherland and comes to a community of strangers and goes inside the house of a rich man, and everyone who sees him there is shocked. So was Achilles shocked when he saw Priam appearing like a god. So were the others. Startled, they glanced at one another. Priam spoke to Achilles, and this was his prayer. Godlike Achilles, think of your own father, who is as old as I am, standing over the final threshold between age and death. The people in the neighboring estates probably threaten him, and there is no one to save him from the danger of destruction. And yet at least he hears you are alive, and so his heart is glad, and every day he hopes to see his own beloved son come home from Troy, while I have been the most unlucky man alive. In spacious Troy I had the finest sons, of whom not one is left. I once had 50 in the days before the Greeks arrived. I had just one who kept our town and people safe, and you killed him a short while ago while he was fighting for his fatherland. Hector, I came here to your ships for him, to ransom him from you. I brought with me a countless ransom. Please, Achilles, show reverence towards the gods and pity me, remembering your father Peleus. I am more pitiable than him. I have endured what no man yet on earth has done. I pressed my mouth into the hand of him who killed my son." This made Achilles yearn to mourn his father. With his hand, he gently took hold of the old man and pushed him back. Then both remembered those whom they had lost. Curled in a ball beside Achilles' feet, Priam sobbed desperately for murderous Hector. Achilles wept, at times for his own father, and sometimes for Patroclus. So their wailing suffused the house. Let's stop there. Thank you. Love to have questions.
Okay, great. Some time for questions then.
Hi, what's the pushback to your translation style?
So
What's the pushback in the community, I guess, to your translation style?
The community.
The community of translators, other translators, like in your field, or if there is pushback at all. I don't know.
I feel like there's been I feel really grateful for a really, really positive response. I feel like I've talked to lots of colleagues who are using these translations in the classroom, and it's lovely to hear of it, working in the classroom. I also get emails every week from random strangers who are reading it, and it's lovely. I love that. It's my favorite thing. I know that I've also had lots of lovely reviews by colleagues. There was a whole sort of online discourse thing, which I think was partly a response to the "Emily Wilson is a woman, you go girl" headlines, which then, of course, produced the absolutely predictable, inevitable "no, you don't go girl" kind of response, right? Which is none of that's to do with my translation style, but it's sometimes linked to it. But yeah. Of course, also, if people don't like the translation style, they can use another one. There's over 70 English translations and then plenty more in other languages. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much. Great talk. There's been a lot of conversations and debate about the exact relationship between Achilles and Patroclus, were they best friends, companions, lovers. I was curious about the decisions you had to take to decide how you represent the relationship between the two.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seemed to me really important for the whole narrative arc of the poem, which hinges so much on Achilles' emotional arc, that we have to understand how intimately connected they are. But we also have to, I can't make up a sex scene when there isn't a sex scene, right? And there isn't a sex scene. And what there is very explicitly is Achilles and Patroclus are both sleeping beside enslaved women whom Achilles has enslaved and provided them with. And then we do have sex scenes in Homer. It's not like there's no moment in Homer where the narrator says, and then they went and had sex. Within the world of the Iliad, it seems to me really important that the characters who are represented as having sex despise each other. So there's a wonderful scene in Book 14 of the Iliad where Hera, whose plans are always opposed to the plans of Zeus, seduces him so he'll take a nap, and then she piles on by getting the gods sleep to send him even more deeply to sleep. She's having sex with him, putting on her great earrings and all that, because she wants him distracted so that she can wreak havoc on the battlefield. It's not because she loves him. And similarly, Helen very much doesn't want to go to bed with Paris. In the end of Book 3, Aphrodite pushes her into it. It's also interesting that the only moment where we see a female mortal character being compelled to have sex with someone is not, even though we sort of have the implicit thing of there is all this captivity and rape, that's when it happens, is Aphrodite and Helen. I thought within that background, there's a particular way that the relationship of Achilles and Patroclus is presented as somehow deeper than that. We also know that in the 5th century in Athens, where of course there was a very established culture of older men and younger men within elite male Athenian society having relationships, and that was sort of part of networking in Athenian male society was man-boy relationships. that the Achilles-Patroclus relationship was interpreted by people like Aeschylus and then later by Plato as definitely they were lovers, definitely as a romantic relationship in every sense that an Athenian pair of guys would have a romantic relationship. So I felt that as a translator, I need to make sure that the emotional bond is totally clear, but without making up stuff that isn't there in the text. And I worried about it. I mean, I worried about, are people going to be disappointed if they come to this poem from Song of Achilles? It's a very different narrative arc from that, and you just got to adjust to something else. Yeah.
With, translating ancient texts and how big of a history it has, do you find it difficult to choose between broader interpretations that people have held or personal interpretations? Or has that affected how you go about the translation? For example, you talked about how you found the head metaphor to be important to the text, but a lot of the literary tradition so far hasn't put mention to it. Do you find it difficult then to almost justify putting in the head metaphor in your own translation, given the previous tradition? Or do you put a lot of importance on your own personal interpretations?
I mean, I guess I would say that in that case, I'm putting a lot of importance on the actual Greek, right? The Greek is unambiguously saying head, right? So it's not that I felt, I need to go back and check 80 different translations and see if they put head, and then only then can I do this. I can be justified by the original. So I feel like it's not between me personally and everyone else. It's about, if this is what the Greek unambiguously means, then I want to try to convey that if I possibly can. And of course, there's also, it's not that I think it's unjustifiable to eliminate a metaphor, because I think that if the phrases like, I loved him like my whole self, it conveys quite a lot of what's going on with that. It just doesn't have the metaphor. So I think actually if I hadn't deliberately sort of set myself at the start to be on the lookout for, even if the metaphor is a little bit weird, I want wherever possible to get the metaphors of Homer across in the translation, I might not have, I had a very conscious idea that I want the metaphors, if possible, to be the he's my head kind of the alien things that are there in the original, rather than the burning desires. This is going to be familiar, but it's not the metaphor of the original kind. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering, you said earlier that there was a gap that, you filled that in the translations, and that there was, ones that were more based on prose, ones that were more literal. Why do you think it is that there was that gap, that there was this space for, the 20th century, a lot of, the 21st, that there was this idea of, we have to have this language that, sounds old-timey, that, we have to make it sound super literal, all those kinds of things. Why do you think that was, that, you were the person to, in all this time, you were the person to do that, to decide, I really want to get the essence of, of this and see the proper verbiage, I guess, because people don't necessarily realize, this would have been something that a lot of people could have understood, versus, if you read some of the older translations, it's, it feels like they're purposefully using language that can be very difficult for the average reader. So kind of what's your opinion on that it took so long to get to this place, that it really captures the complete vibe of the original?
I'm very grateful for that question, but I also think, I think these other translators, I want to give them credit. It's not that I think they were sort of trying to distort. I think, and mine distorts in a lot of ways too. Mine is also different from the original. I mean, I guess I would emphasize that in some ways, I think the Fagles translations and the Lombardo translations are very much going towards, we want it to be the language of the people. I had a different set of priorities about using traditional meter, which was different from the free verse translations like those. So I don't think it was the case that sort of nobody else really cared about trying to evoke the experience of Homer. It's just the question of how do you do that, and which elements of the experience of Homer are you going to prioritize? That it's up for some debate, and there are different ways of doing it. There's several different ways legitimate. Picasso can do his own self-portraits in several different ways, and that's actually okay. I felt that there was, sometimes there can be sort of blocks in culture. Sometimes there can be wonderful fire goes on to fire and fire goes on to fire, to use your wonderful metaphor again, Ron. But then sometimes it can be that, okay, we're still by this same fire, and we're just going to copy the same fire. I've been really startled sometimes by looking at, when I do this exercise with different passages, and I see, actually it's really clear that in this page of Fagles, he was really closely looking back to Fitzgerald and Lattimore, and that there are really close verbal echoes from one translator to another. I think that can be limiting. I think if you spend so much time, maybe this also goes to your question, if you spend so much time worrying about what did my honored colleague Professor Lattimore do, I'm going to have to echo that phrasing in this passage, then you're not necessarily thinking about the Greek again in a fresh way. I also do think that the fact that I sort of had this double training with English literature as well as classical literature, and I was sort of trying to take seriously the poetic possibilities of the English language, I think that, I hope that that helped in some way or other. It's not that no other translator was ever thinking about English either. I don't want to be sort of saying bad things about my dear colleagues, because I admire them, and I've worked with them, and I've used them in the classroom too. But I think there are ways that a culture can sort of feel like there isn't any other possible way of doing it if it's been done multiple times, more or less the same way. Yeah, thank you.
Time for one more question then, yeah.
Thank you, Professor Wilson. I had a question about your thoughts on pacing.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you tied yourself to the same number of lines as Homer, and you chose iambic pentameter, and then maybe loosen that in the Iliad. How do you make decisions about? Well, I guess in the Greek you get up to 16, 17 syllables per line versus the 10 that you get in English. And did you have to make decisions to leave things that were represented in the Greek out by doing that, or did you find that maybe the semantic density of Greek was lower or something like that? And I'm especially curious with reference to your own line that you critiqued. What were you seeing about pacing there? It seems like if you've got the lines tied together the way you did, that the story moves along at least line by line at the same pace as the Homer. So I'm wondering what you were thinking about in terms of getting the pacing right with that line.
Thank you so much for that. Yes. Just in terms of that line, I felt that I want, if possible, if it's a single assertion in the Greek, it would be great if I could make it a single assertion in the English, as opposed to I lost him, destroyed him. Whereas there's two different assertions there. And I felt I couldn't do that without doing that. I had to do something like that in English to make sure it lands and is really clear emotionally, along with its complexities. That question about how many syllables are there in the line is really interesting. And Homeric Greek, like Greek in general, has a ton of particles and also has a ton of very long compound words. So if Odysseus is polumekanos, he can very easily be crafty in English, and then I've just saved myself a ton of syllables, and I can make it into a pentameter, right? And it's actually, even translators who don't do the various kinds of restrictions that I do very often do things like that, of having, he's going to be crafty, 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 as opposed to whatever a 5 or 6 syllable word for crafty would be, because English doesn't tend to go for that. And then also all of those little te, ge, per, syllables. You don't necessarily have to have an English sentence or an English line that has equivalents to every single te and men and de. I did feel that with the Odyssey, with limiting myself to the same number of lines, there were some cases where I felt, okay, I can almost do this, but I'm going to have to make Dios Odysseus, that's going to be just equivalent to capital O Odysseus. Because that is kind of what it means. It means our hero Odysseus, who's very important, and his name is spelled with a capital O, and maybe he's kind of godlike. But maybe I don't have to repeat godlike absolutely every time, or shining or bright or glorious absolutely every time he's Dios Odysseus. But now that I'm going back and revising it, I think I'm going to add in more epithets and allow for a little bit more repetition in terms of the epithets, because that's one of the things I really struggle with, is to what degree does the repetitiveness of the original feel the same in a translation, where we have totally different expectations about how repetition lands for the reader or for the listener. Thank you.
We did have one question online about if you had any favorite lines from either the Iliad or the Odyssey.
Have your favorite lines?
Lines, yeah, favorite lines from
Favorite
either.
lines
Yeah.
of Homer in
Yes.
general? No, so many favorite lines. What am I going to go for? Kaise geron to prin menakuomen olbion einai. So that's Achilles talking to Priam. I love the simplicity of it, which contains so much. So he's saying, and I don't remember how I translated it, but anyway, he's saying, you too, old man, we've heard that once upon a time, you used to be fortunate too. And so it sort of traces this whole absolute reversal of Priam from somebody who had a flourishing city and his children were alive to now, not so much. And then there's both a sense of distance and enormous emotional intimacy. And none of the words are difficult. They're all like, if you take one semester of Greek, you know all of these words. And yet, so much is packed into a single line.
In closing, Emily Wilson did an interview on KGZZ with Sam Dingman, who's here tonight. And she said this: translation is very hard to talk about. I'm constantly reaching for something which I don't know what the words are. So in that way, for me, it's inherently quasi-spiritual quest, what's a little bit beyond what a mortal human being could do. And these epics, the Odyssey and the Iliad, are so constantly engaged with that question too, that question of what slippage might there be between mortals and immortals, and what would it be like to be the kind of mortal who even for a moment could have an encounter with the divine. So let's thank Emily Wilson, who brings a spark of the divine to us tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.